Good afternoon and welcome to this virtual event. My name is Tiff Macklem and I have the great pleasure of being the Dean of the Rotman School of Management. I want to welcome you to this, our fourth in a series of webinars focused really on responding to and learning from and adapting to the COVID-19 crisis and the challenges related to it. Each week our goal has been to bring evidence-based perspectives from leading academics and from leaders in business on how to cope, how to manage, and how to lead through this unprecedented crisis. And today we're going to focus on innovation readiness. How organized is your organization? What is the capacity in your organization to adapt and thrive against an extraordinarily challenging situation? The reality is opening the economy is going to be harder than closing it. The virus is still out there and we're all going to have to find new ways to serve our customers. What our customers need and want is going to be shifting. We're going to have to find new ways to work in an environment where we need to maintain our health at the same time. This is going to require a tremendous amount of ingenuity and innovation. It's going to require resilience. The way I would put it is that, often in business schools we talk about innovation as a source of competitive advantage. Well, right now it's a source of necessity. We're simply going to have to find new ways to work and serve our customers against a background of a new normal. Some of you are working in organizations that are probably virtually shut down. Others have managed to pivot, have found new ways to work remotely and deliver many of the services, or in some cases goods, that you were delivering previously. As the economy reopens, there's going to be a whole new phase of change. And so against that background, we're going to focus very much on innovation and innovation capacity. What does innovation readiness mean? How ready is your organization? How do we develop that innovation readiness? How do we seize the opportunity and respond to the crisis? And I'm very pleased we have three very special guests today to lead us in thinking through this. And so let me introduce them. First, we have Professor Angèle Beausoleil. Angèle is Academic Director of the Business Design Initiative at Rotman, which is an education and research center focused on design-led innovation leadership. Angèle is a former communication designer, a senior strategist, and innovation lab executive, and she applies extensive industry experience in human-centered design. She teaches in our MBA program, in our commerce program. She also teaches in our executive programs. And Dr. Beausoleil is Canada's first PhD in innovation pedagogy. Angèle is joined by Azadeh Houshmand. Azadeh is a Rotman graduate from our MBA program, and she's now the Director of Client Experience Design Strategy at RBC. So you can imagine your clients have rapidly different needs, and you're having to think about a whole new delivery platform. As an innovation strategy consultant, Azadeh has helped numerous organizations in multiple industries better understand their customers in order to drive innovation. And our third panelist is Emma Aiken-Klar. She is the SVP of Global Insights at IDEA Couture, and she is an advisor for the Business Design Initiative at Rotman. Emma basically consults with a wide range of very large, mostly pretty large companies across multiple industries and helps those teams lead innovation and provide innovation strategies to those companies. So first of all, I want to thank all three of you for joining us. I know this is going to be a wonderful conversation. The way this is going to work is in a second, I'm going to turn it over to Angèle. She's going to give us some lead-off thoughts and insights. And then we're going to engage in a conversation with Azadeh, Emma, and Angèle. And while we're doing that, I encourage you to send questions. If you're on Zoom, you can ask your questions with using the Q&A button on your screen. And we're going to take as many questions as possible. So with that, let's get started. Angèle, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Tiff, for inviting me and some of my industry colleagues to discuss this idea and have a conversation around sort of innovation readiness. And I thought I would just maybe highlight an image just to start to kick us off today in terms of how it might feel for some of you in terms of facing the current crisis and navigating your journey right now, and how it might feel like you're on a roller coaster. So of course I had to pick one of the most interesting roller coasters, I believe, at Canada's Wonderland to maybe kick us off today, because it could feel that way. But what I'm hoping that through the initial conversation today, that perhaps you find a way to maybe embrace that feeling of a roller coaster, but how aside from feeling, what's really happening is that you're evolving your routines. And so over the next few minutes, I want to cover some three sort of key areas in terms of innovation readiness, because we need to understand what we even mean by innovation. So allow me to perhaps frame it for you, and then also showcase some examples of why we should all sort of be improving our readiness to essentially face it and ultimately really navigate it. So I want to cover three things. I'm going to introduce you to a few sort of influential ideologies of innovation, those that have really impacted our decision making, and then offer you ways of thinking about innovation readiness through some factors. There are three that I'm really going to unpack today. And then ultimately, how do we actually offer you today and hopefully after today and tomorrow and post-COVID, ways of navigating sort of taking aspects of this new normal and being transformed in a really positive way moving forward. So that's what I'm going to unpack. And so let me begin with how, I guess, a bit of a demystification of our relationship with innovation. So you may or may not be aware that there really have been sort of two critical ideologies introduced in the early 20th century around innovation. And so this is part of the research that I've been delving in the last 7 years or so deeply. And the idea of the pervasive sort of economic model that we are probably more familiar with, which was introduced by this economist, Joseph Schumpeter. And he's the guy who coined the phrase creative destruction. So you may have heard that. And it's essentially relating to this idea of waves of radically new things and technology-oriented change. So examples of that would be, of course, the printing press, or some of us may be familiar with Ford's assembly line when the new Model T came out. Of course, we can associate this with the internet as being a radical and significant change. And some of us also with the Apple iPhone. So these are sort of examples of sort of these very disruptive technological shifts and our relationship with innovation. And then there's another ideology that has been quite impactful. And it's more of a socioeconomic and introduced by the father of sociology, Gabriel Tarde. And what Tarde really has offered the world is his view and perception of observing how we as humans love to imitate ourselves and other humans. And so the idea of sort of this constant, continuous human evolution is really based on how we constantly want to improve situations into preferred ones. And so we tend to think of more of this societal or socioeconomic towards more incremental innovation, and those specifically that are responding to human needs. And so we might also think of innovation as more of a process than, for example, than an output. And this would also kind of aligns us to where we think of rearranging and recombining and rethinking people, places, and products. So those are sort of two of the key ideas. And so if you're kind of leaning towards where you believe maybe your relationship with innovation is, this would be more of that sort of process where we think of it more more ecosystem wide. So for example, when Apple introduced iTunes, it wasn't so much about the iPod so much as it gave those of us who really wanted the need to create our personal playlists an opportunity to really develop a personal experience with music. And so that was a way of thinking at it from more of a system level. And some of us may also be more familiar with even Tesla's work, particularly around electric vehicles and thinking about our need as humans in terms of mobility. And then of course, leveraging the most incredible power of solar technology to really help us move around more effectively and ecologically. So these are sort of these critical ideologies have really impacted our personal philosophies, our beliefs, our mindsets, and ultimately our relationship with innovation. So much so that we make decisions and we actually act certain ways when we are faced with new challenges, new things, new technologies. And of course, ultimately, all of this really means that it's about developing a relationship with change. Because innovation is ultimately introducing something that is perceived as new, and how we respond to that change is kind of those underlying kind of beliefs. And so some of us may resist change, some of us may embrace it, some of us may actually have sometimes we resist, sometimes we engage with change, but how we ultimately navigate it, how we lead and manage it is really a reflection of our level of readiness and our ability to adapt and adopt change. And so I'm going to introduce you to some of the work specifically that I've been working on in terms of innovation readiness, and introduce you to 3 really critical factors that we can assess ourselves. You can assess yourself. We're going to do that today in terms of how you perhaps see your level of facing and navigating, leading and managing sort of through change. And so one of the most fundamental is this, the level of openness. Now you're going to be familiar with openness. It's one of the 5 critical key personality traits that you would be very familiar with. Of course, openness is often reflects your orientation towards experimenting with new things, trying new things. And it's also directly associated with imagination. So how imaginative are you? How curious are you? So the level of openness really provides that foundation in terms of your readiness. And another critical factor is about your attitude towards adopting new things, new ideas. So for example, how quickly are you to embrace new ways of working? How did you actually settle in at home? And asking yourself essentially, when do you adopt new things? So I find it really interesting when I've studied and I've worked in industry and now as an academic to find fascinating differences in terms of when we adopt new things. So I've known, and I've got good friends who are gadget hounds. They love new gadgets, and yet when it comes to actually adopting new processes or new ways of working, there's some resistance. So it's really interesting to understand the context of when we actually adopt new ways, and what are those environments? So it's important to understand that level of adoption. And the third important factor is your adaptability. So your ability to adapt to new and unfamiliar contexts and cultures. So for example, when you were setting up, because we've all had to move remotely, how did you actually adapt, to kind of your learning spaces? So of course I was teaching, and so how did the students, adapt to creating their home into a learning space, and for us in terms of working spaces? And also, how are you in terms of new languages and new processes? And so, do you plan ahead? Do you jump in? And so how quickly you also adapt, as well as how you adapt, are ways to understand your level of readiness, and particularly navigating through this pandemic. And so some of us, of course, have had to adapt to multiple, and I know Emma here is having to adapt to this as a working mother, and I'm fortunate. I have a 16-year-old, so of course we don't see him. He's away and working away. But there's some of us that really, we have to truly adapt the way we live, the way we teach, the way we engage with our home, our family. Those are sharing these kind of remote areas within the social distancing time. And so I'm now going to find out how you, as our listeners and participants, what's your level of innovativeness? We would love to find out. So we're going to open up a poll to find out how innovation ready are you? And so for some of you who are on our YouTube channel, you're going to have a bit of difficulty. You're not going to be able to participate actively, but you will start seeing, as you can see in terms of our live streaming, the way in which everyone's assessing themselves in terms of level of innovation readiness. So this is great doing this live. We're seeing how you really feel in terms of your assessment. So let's see here. We're just starting. I see the poll, and we're coming through. This is great. I think we have hundreds of, oh, we've got 500 that are actually responding to this. So of course, as you can see, these are three factors. Of course, there's a correlation directly from being, your level of openness to your level of ability to adopt and then to adapt. And so I'm just seeing, are we almost, I think we're good. Okay, here we go. These are our poll results. So I love this going live. Those of you who haven't been able to participate, hopefully you've even taken the poll on a notepad next to you. So what we've looked at here is essentially when it comes to your level of openness, perhaps like we have a majority, I love this, that are really, that feel, they have a very high level of openness. And so that's going to give us a direct correlation in terms of your attitude towards adoption. And I'm just kind of seeing, here we go. I'm just going to move this around. And so, wow, across the board, we're certainly seeing a very high percentage or skew, which might also indicate why you signed on and you are listening into today's webinar, because it's something of interest to you and that you're actually reflecting this. So thank you so much. This is great. And I'm going to take a screen grab of this because I want to see how we've got this nice little national data point in terms of your level of innovation readiness. So this sounds pretty great. It also shows that there is a will and an eagerness to actually develop that readiness. And so as we're, so we've got, here we go, some more of the poll results. I think we're good. I'm just going to move this over here. So ways of which to really, for those of you who are open, you may have done this already, and of those who have adopted and adapted, again, what are further ways? Because it's one of these things where we can continue to improve in terms of our level of readiness, because we continue to evolve and face new and unfamiliar circumstances. And so a small step to really express that would be how you've rearranged your workspace and your learning space. Small actions in terms of rethinking, moving things around in your place, and also encouraging those that you share your home with in terms of new places and spaces to really engage in, because it'll also give you a different perspective. So I think those are sort of some small steps that you can take. And as well, for those of us who really have a family context, we're sharing a fairly small space for the most part, and we're sharing it, and we're acting in a variety of ways. So our roles and our tasks move from perhaps being a senior leader in some cases to perhaps being a homeschool teacher. And so to really think of embracing this idea of continuous learning. So readiness, and what the poll suggests here is that we've got in today's group, I think a reflection of learners who are willing to just continuously learn, adopt, experiment, try new things, convert an opportunity to make lunch together into a greater learning opportunity, and experiment. Again, those small steps of even experimenting in the kitchen can pay in dividends in terms of how you apply that to how you manage teams, how you actually congregate and convene and engage in these small experiments. So again, don't underestimate the power of what you can do in your home and how it relates to what you can do in terms of your working relationships as well. So those are a few things, but I'm really eager to have my colleagues join in this conversation in terms of really helping you improve your innovation readiness.
Thank you, Angèle. And I'm very pleased to see that this group is they're innovation ready.
Yeah.
So let's draw in Azadeh and Emma and take this from the world of academia to the front lines of applying some of these ideas. And Azadeh, maybe I'll start with you. You're working at, by some measures, Canada's largest company, millions of clients, with a whole new set of needs and a whole new way. You need to find a whole new way to deliver on these new customer demands. Maybe you could just say a few words about, how has RBC, tried to get innovation ready, and then how is this working against an extremely uncertain and rapidly evolving set of circumstances?
Yeah, absolutely, Tiff. I mean, as you mentioned earlier, innovation right now more than ever, it's not, it's no longer a nice to have, it's a must to have. And I think, the factors that Angèle mentioned around those three factors of openness, adopting to new things and adapting has been a big focus for RBC, I think, in the past few years for sure. And, we've been investing a lot in terms of, being more human-centric, bringing in design capabilities, client experience, and all that stuff. And all of it is because, we're very much invested in understanding what's changing all the time with clients, and more than ever right now, I think that understanding of changes is extremely important and critical, because things are changing very fast, and, we're no longer able to think about, if you think of the well-known model of design thinking, which is focused on, viability, feasibility, and desirability. And, typically, if you're not thinking about client, you start with what's viable from a business perspective. You figure out what's feasible in terms of technology, and then you think about, what's desirable in terms of client. And I think right now it's more than ever before, it's important to start with what's desirable. So the key thing for RBC and for us is to really focus on that desirability. And a big factor for that is empathy. And right now, as we know it, we basically are forced to put a premium on empathy and think about a new type of empathy. And that empathy is very much rooted in, in deep connections, very, very deep understanding of clients, very basic interactions. So in terms of, what we're doing, we're really focusing on understanding why people are doing what they're doing, what's changing, so we can create a very distinctive value that is almost sort of, going back to basic and simple interactions and relationships. So I think, the fact that we started this journey a few years ago gave us a very good sort of opportunity to leverage it now and go very much deep into this understanding of humans and why people do what they do and what they expect from a bank to do things differently for them.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I would agree. My experience in crises is that this back to basics idea is really central. We live in such a sophisticated environment with all kinds of systems, and then all of a sudden now we can't do things the way we used to do them. And so you do have to kind of get back to basics. What are the fundamental things that people need? And if you strip out all the fancy schmancy stuff we have that we can't do right now, how do we solve for those basic needs? Emma, I want to draw you in. I'd be very interested to hear, you consult regularly with Fortune 500 companies. What are you hearing in terms of from your clients? What do your clients want right now compared to say 2 months ago?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's a great question. I think what we're seeing right now is a tension that's inherent in innovation generally, between how we understand this sort of, most big organizations, there's a bias towards immediate impact, and there's a bias towards being able to demonstrate performance. And these biases are at odds with the ambiguity required for innovation, right? So what we're seeing is, in the context of COVID, most of the organizations that we work with and our clients, they're going into business continuity planning. So they're busy creating plans that are going to enable operations, and they're creating systems for loss prevention and recovery right now. Those processes are inherently at odds with the kind of openness required, the adaptability. So it's a really interesting time from an innovation perspective, because our clients are needing to do both of these opposite things at the same time: business continuity, and then pivot what they can do based on the capabilities they have today. I think, similar to what Azadeh was saying, what's going on with RBC, I think the most important thing that we're seeing is that our clients and us as well, Idea Couture sits in Cognizant, we're driven by a sense of purpose around what our clients and customers need right now. So going back to that sense of what is going on in the world, what do the people that we serve need right now, and how can we quickly pivot what we're able to do to serve those needs? Yeah.
So one of the things you often hear, particularly from people who work in large companies, is that there's lots of great ideas, but there are barriers to innovation, and often in large organizations, particularly that sort of the middle of the company, the middle management sometimes is not as open to change as needed. Now, my guess is that there is, by necessity, a new openness to change. Simply, you can't deliver the way you were delivering. So I think everybody is looking for new solutions. And Angèle, maybe you could just sort of start with you. What are some of the traditional blockers, and what advice do you have to try to cut through those, particularly in the current environment where there is a real need to move very quickly?
So it's a great question. And I think the greatest barrier, of course, because organizations are comprised of humans, it's humans that are making the decisions. We can't always point to the system, although we like to. But I think that's part of it as well, is to take some accountability and begin with actually feeling that you're empowered and that you have permission to maybe make decisions that may not necessarily reflect what may be perhaps the norm in terms of traditional thinking, but taking those maybe small or calculated risks in terms of making decisions that are really about kind of need driven, as opposed to, say, technology, and understanding that your point of view and your ability to make decisions should be informed from more of a greater sort of systems level. And I think too many times, and we've seen some organizations unfortunately fail or not survive because they're so wedded and so deeply embedded into what they believe to be like a truth. And I think the barrier, the greatest barrier, is to accept that markets evolve, customers evolve, business models must evolve accordingly. And so the idea that if you're so stuck in a particular model, give yourself permission to actually allow yourself to see how can we improve it. So I think it really begins with the senior decision makers, supported by an incredible, of course, employee and stakeholder group, and ultimately listening to the voice of the market and the customers. And I think that decision making should be informed, but should also, and building on Azadeh's point, should be maybe we're moving towards more empathy than we have before. So perhaps more, we've been from a tech-driven, progress-driven. It sounds like right now there's a correction in place, and I'd say, if anything, probably more of a forced. It's more of a forced compliance as opposed to an open willingness. So I think if we can maybe migrate from that engaging from a forced compliance, how can we learn from it, would be fantastic. But I think the barrier is definitely in that decision making and from the senior decision makers.
So Emma, you've given lots of companies advice. I'm sure you've seen some companies that have really embraced the opportunity and moved quickly. You've seen some companies where things have run aground.
Yeah.
Maybe you could tell us a little bit about, what are some of the key success factors for being successful and driving the innovation forward?
Yeah, I think that having one of the most important things, and we know this from anthropology, so I'm an anthropologist by training, and we know that in difficult transformations and periods of transformation, we go through this sort of really ambiguous liminal period where we're no longer what we were, but we're not yet what we're going to become. And I think we're seeing that right now. We're in this, what Victor Turner called this betwixt and between phase. And the thing that I think really helps an organization move through this is a really strong sense of purpose and an understanding of what we're moving towards and what we hope to be when this is over. And sometimes that purpose it needs to be adapted really, really quickly. So the companies that are small and agile and really, really flexible, and you're seeing this more in the startup scene, that they're able to sort of really pivot what it is, what they do and why against a very quickly formulated goal and purpose and a driver. It's a lot harder, I think, for bigger organizations to make those pivots, because the thing, to Angèle's point around decision making, that thing, that North Star, that thing that's guiding our decisions in this betwixt and between state may not be relevant to what's happening in the world right now. So that ability to redefine your purpose and use that purpose to drive really quick decision making, we're seeing as an amazing enabler for people to pivot right now. What this practically translates to are teams that have the autonomy to do what needs to be done, irrespective of known outcomes, because the purpose of their organization allows them to make that decision right now.
So clarity of purpose within some decentralization and of decision making to allow things to move quickly.
Yeah, that's
Azadeh, let me come back to you. Where I started, you work at one of Canada's largest companies, and a company that's been extremely successful for a long time. Change in some ways must be a bit of a hard sell. I mean, you're not a startup. You've
Right.
arrived. How do you try to break down these barriers to innovation within a place like RBC?
Yeah, very interesting. And I mean, like, this is such a fascinating time to talk about, these things, because, there are obviously like the obvious ones that are barriers in terms of change, and especially in a big organization like culture, lack of technology, lack of clarity on vision, strategy, all of those things are the obvious ones. But I think the one that it's sort of very important for me, and I think Angèle and Emma was sort of talking about that as well, it's sort of the lack of openness to have a new space for doing things differently. So, and basically what I mean by that is that, if you don't have the willingness and the ability to create a new space so you can be open, so you can, do things differently, you can do things faster, then I think that would be a huge barrier for a company, especially for a big company like a big bank. Basically what I call this is sort of like if you don't have the time to stop and smell the roses, you're basically not having the right space or any space for creativity. So you have to be able to create this space to pause, frame the right problems, frame the problems differently, be able to think about the D that I mentioned in desirability, go deeper, going back to basics, understanding what's really underneath what people want. And if you're not able to create that space, I don't think you will be able to, you know, innovate as fast as you can. And this is the perfect time for that type of space, because people are so open to things that are not perfect. You know, people are very open to seeing things. And, you know, if you see companies trying to make something happen, they appreciate that. So it's the perfect time for companies to Emma's point, to be agile, to, you know, test and do things differently and learn and experiment. And, you know, basically pause and smell the roses, and also look up and watch other people and how they're, you know, doing that as well, because you want to learn and kind of be able to create that space even better as we move on to, you know, the new normal.
I want to come back to this idea of human-centered design. You know, the themes of empathy, back to basics. It just seems like now more than ever is a time for human-centered design. We have some very real human needs, and we need to find new ways to address those. Angèle, maybe you could just begin by giving us what is different about human-centered design? I mean, what would be some of the key things we need to be thinking about, that particularly against the background of the crisis we're facing today as we think about human-centered design? And then Emma and Azadeh, I'll come back to you.
Great question, Tiff. So there's a bit of a, I guess, a double entendre when you introduce sort of design. The idea is that the concept of designing for humans is embedded within that notion. Definitely, I'd say design is in an incredible renaissance right now, where once, I'd say, design was perhaps in the hands of very few. We have it now distributed across many. And so it's not just about designing, for example, structures and, you know, architectural design, so on and so forth, but that we can truly design, particularly in the realm of business, we can design and redesign better businesses, again, that can evolve and grow. And the idea of human-centered design is exactly that. It's actually making decisions. Now, these are not, of course, not unprofitable decisions, but what we're saying is we're actually thinking about who are we ultimately serving. And it should be essentially, it could be internal stakeholders, external stakeholders. And so the idea of applying human-centered design, particularly when it comes to innovation, is thinking about that human need. And then to Azadeh's point of that desirability, both from a need and a want or an opportunity, is really core in terms of the decisions you're making. So if applying human-centered design to ourselves would be, you know, our needs, our families' needs, essentially our society's needs. And so, of course, we're kind of heading into that sociology sort of side of the world of really thinking of that socioeconomic sort of system. And that's what human-centered design ultimately promises. It's a matter of really thinking and making a decision that begins with what's the need, and then designing or redesigning our places of work, our cultures, our products and services that really serve the need and also profit and ultimately make an incredible impact.
So Azadeh, I'd be interested to get a little bit of input from you. So how do you put this into practice in an environment where we need to move very quickly? I mean, the key to human-centered design is, yes, you need to be empathetic. You need to think about what your customer needs. But, you know, to do that, you need to talk to your customer. You need to survey your customers. You need to engage your customers. Then you need to iterate, and then you need to roll something out. Now you have to do that all in the matter of a few weeks. Maybe you could say a few words about, you know, how at RBC have you tried to adapt this to deal with the extraordinary timelines that everybody's facing?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the beauty of, you know, like this type of work and really trying to understand desirability is that you can embed it into, you know, the way of thinking. You can embed it in terms of, you know, making strategic choices or priorities. And right now we're getting to a point at RBC that I think, because this is such an important factor in terms of making decisions and prioritizing sort of, future initiatives or anything, we constantly try to find ways to, talk to clients. If it's not, a 4 months long research, we will find a way to talk to, as many people as we can, and start something that's not perfect, but at least it's a start for us to kind of go to a direction. And, I'm thinking of the diamond, like diverging in terms of ideas. And then as we move along in the process, then we do more testing with clients, more talking to people, and then we narrow and filter to an idea that it's desirable, it's viable for the business, and it's also, something that we can support by technology and feasibility. So we try to make it, as iterative as possible. It might not be a linear type of process. And I think right now more than ever, we have to be agile and okay with just moving with something, and then we build what we don't have later on in the process.
Yeah, don't let perfection be the enemy of the good. Emma, I see you nodding.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that human-centered design is at the core of what we do and what we like to enable for our clients. Because I think what we see is that our clients and most organizations today are competing on the experiences that they provide. So in an experience economy, human-centered design is what unlocks one's ability to compete. I think what we're seeing in this moment, though, in this sort of, we're in the midst of this sort of COVID liminality. The needs that we're designing against, and I sort of hate to use Maslow's scale, but it makes a lot of sense right now. We're working in a very, very basic place right now. We're not innovating. Human-centered design isn't necessarily driving, as you said at the beginning, competitive differentiation or point of difference. What we're doing right now is applying human-centered design thinking, human-centered design strategy to solving some gaping holes right now for our clients and for the people and the customers that they serve. So while in a perfect world, that might mean we're going to go out there and do some rigorous ethnographic research, and we're going to pair that with some design research, and we're going to go and then quantify all that and do a behavioral driver study, because we've got a behavioral science team as well. That's not happening right now. What we're relying on is what we understand from our client partners, what we understand from our account teams, the established knowledge base, and quite honestly, the common sense that we know and what you can see and address in the world right now. But it's really about keeping the human need in mind as we're making these decisions. And when we get back to a place where we have time, that luxury of time to do that rigorous work, sure, we're going to go ahead and do it. But I don't think not being able to do that sort of situated research precludes human-centered design right now at all.
I'm getting all sorts of good questions here from our audience. And one of the questions that, speaking of sort of human-centered design, I think as humans, we all can't wait to just go back to normal. We just, we'd like to just get over this change phase and get back to normal. First of all, the reality is that's going to take a long time. And some things probably will change forever. Maybe you could, Angèle, I'll start with you. As this rolls forward, there are these sort of cross currents, a desire to just go back to where we were versus the cross current to learn from this and innovate and take some silver linings from this and do things better. How does an organization position itself to benefit from how things change over time?
Great question for the participant and the reframing, Tiff. I think we have to first of all acknowledge that we are changed. We have changed. And I think that's a big acknowledgement that just we have to accept the fact that we are going through and experiencing and sensing a dramatic change that is affecting the entire globe. And I think we will come out of this changed. It's a matter of, I think, to your point, so how do we navigate through that, or what are we taking away with it, and how do we build upon maybe that change state? And I'd say, if of anything, I think what we're going to see, and we're already seeing, I think, hints of that, particularly with some of, I'd say, enterprising and innovative Canadian companies, is a way of, and I know there's a great conversation around the hammer and the dance right now, and I'm going to build on the dance, and I'm going to say there's probably going to be a very interesting shuffle or a dance that's going to be really between what we used to know as the normal and what we've now been exposed to as this new normal, and create some new blends. So, we're starting to see the trends in terms of this blending of human and technology. I know, Tiff, at Rotman, we're delivering virtual classrooms. I had 2 days to prepare for 5 classes. I'm sure those on the call today, many others who've had to shift and pivot quickly, we've had to dance. So we're moving from in-person to virtual. Companies are blending, I think, a lot more of the technology with the virtual teams, and then how that's going to impact in terms of in-person. So I think there's going to be some dancing and some shuffling and some, I think, some new blends and hybrids we haven't seen before, including, and maybe I'll pause there because I know my colleagues, we've had conversations about this before, including some really new and exciting collaborations. I think we're going to see new forms of partnerships.
Yeah. I was just thinking, as you were saying that, Angèle, that this is whatever new normal we get to, the concept of ecosystems and really rethinking who your competitors are and who your collaborators are in order to deliver value to the market. I think we're already seeing that. We're seeing some of these massive companies that are able to, I think it was just in the news that I think is it GSK and Sanofi are now partnering to produce a vaccine. And, you've seen this in a few different places and spaces. Even at a more local level, you've got, local restaurants that are working to produce experiences around food. So Mildred's Temple Kitchen, I just saw on the weekend, is producing videos, how to make some of their famous dishes, right? Whether or not these new forms of experiences that are being created are profitable and create the same streams of revenue that they did afterwards, I think that's a question for me. And that's where the collaboration and ecosystem piece comes in. In a new normal where, let's say, to keep going on the restaurant example, are people ever going to eat in restaurants the same way that they did before? Picture a loud, busy restaurant. People are sitting so super close together. It's hard to imagine that that's ever going to happen again or anytime soon. How might we imagine new ways for these industries to partner with each other? You think delivery, you think experience design, you think virtual experiences. There will be new forms of value creation that will have new kinds of business models with new ways of generating revenue that we can't imagine right now. Right. So when people want to get back to normal, it's going to be a new normal. I know that sounds super trite, but I think there's going to have to be business models that enable different ways of doing this in the future.
And the beauty of this is that we're sort of like consumers and people and businesses, like we're all in it together and learning this, I guess, new normal together. Like this is not something that we've seen in the past or experienced. So I think as long as we stay to, going back to that sort of new empathy, new type of empathy, understanding, learning, and then building and creating together, I think that's going to be something that people are going to be comfortable with, and it won't feel like it's just innovation for the sake of innovation. It's innovation because of something. So why you're innovating, and that's because things are changing.
Well, you're starting to get to, so one of the questions that we're getting from many people, not surprisingly, is that companies are facing huge financial constraints. Many companies, their revenue has dropped substantially. They're looking at every way they can to save money. And so against that background, how do you balance the need for innovation against the need to conserve cash, manage your expenses? I don't know, Emma, I see you're I'm sure you're hearing this from your clients. I mean, what advice can you give them?
I think this is to the point that I brought up earlier around balancing this tension between business continuity, basically keeping the lights on, and the need to continually evolve. I think what innovation means and what it needs to be in a COVID context is sort of turning an innovation upside down a little bit or inside out, whereas innovation used to be something radical, where you may want to look to how do we go outside our core business, develop new capabilities to deliver new forms of value. That may have been one way of looking at radical innovation. I think in a context where you're just struggling for business continuity and keeping those lights on, it's about how maybe innovation just becomes how quickly can I pivot using what I have in order to salvage what I've got, right? So it's less about a longer term, and obviously desirability is always going to be a really important thing to guide what's directing those pivots. But it has to be opportunistic right now. So it's like, what am I able to do and how might I pivot with those capabilities and capacities in order to serve a need right now? And it's less about that longer term, here's where I'd like to be on my second or third horizon. And it's more like, what do I have at my disposal to deliver next week? I think it just reframes what we mean by innovation a little bit.
And maybe I'll offer some examples to build on Emma's points in terms of let's say small manufacturers, particularly. I know if and we've all been following in the news some great stories in terms of resourcefulness, and Tiff, you mentioned ingenuity a little earlier too. For example, utilizing or leveraging your existing manufacturing processes, whether it's the beer, the craft beer makers and across the country, how they've, replaced beer with hand sanitizers, and being able to use their processes and their equipment and all of a sudden do that small pivot, rearrange essentially, in this case, the product that's inside those bottles. But I think that type of, whether it's Canadian ingenuity, we're seeing it around the globe. I think those are, again, hints and possibly trends in terms of what we're going to see post-COVID, and how we can really leverage existing systems, but in a different way. And I agree with Emma as well. Like, obviously this is going to hit the finance folks. Like, this is going to obviously not necessarily result in maybe the profitable margin you were hoping for. However, you're ideally still keeping many people employed. You're just rearranging, rethinking your processes and what you have to offer and offer it. And all the other example I'll just throw it as well is just what's so great to hear from Canada Goose and how they're rethinking and resourcing materials for healthcare scrubs. So I just think we're seeing some, I think, really great examples across Canada.
Yeah. And I think, Angèle, to your point around, this is not it might not be a short-term type of, benefit that you can, look for. This is the time where you have to build long-term relationships and build your, your experiences, client experience, employee experience. And those are the type of investments and things that you will see the benefit in a longer term. And, if you actually don't do it right now, you will probably lose a lot of trust and, like clients and employees and after this is all over. So it is very important to creating that space to be able to, improve on the things that you have and leverage the right partnerships and resources.
I'm sensing from the audience questions that there are many people in the audience that work for larger companies. And while our audience seems very innovation ready, The question suggests that maybe their organizations are not as innovation ready as they are. I'm wondering, we only have a few minutes left, but I'm wondering if if you could give some practical advice. Large companies, let's face it, they've got, there's a big hierarchy. They've got very well-defined decision processes. Many of our large companies, whether they're banks or telecoms, they're heavily regulated. They can't just, that imposes a certain constraints on them. Against a background where we need to move quickly, any just practical tips on how do you sort of change the mindset? How do you change the organization so that good innovations can rise up quickly? And I'll start with you, Azadeh.
I think, I started this, I started from working in a small, medium company and then moved to a bigger company. So it was very different experience, doing innovation in a smaller company and then moving to a bigger one. And, you go in with an expectation that, things are going to change rapidly. And it's, as you mentioned, it's not like that. So I think my advice would be very much thinking about what you can do as a person and kind of reframe or rethink how you're going to make innovation happen, even if it's just you and your immediate team. So kind of try to make things a little better every day, and if things are slow, that's okay. You will see things changing in a longer term. So it's just you need a bit of patience when you're working in a bigger organization, and you just have to keep going with it.
Yeah, I would add, for those of people in the audience who are leaders in their organization, managers, people managers and leaders, I think one of the things that's really important right now in this period of liminality is maybe rethinking and redefining some of the ways that we make sense of the world, specifically around performance. So I think that if we're going to be able to innovate or change or pivot and move through this, we may need to take a good hard look at some of our KPIs and the metrics that we're using to measure individual performance. So the people that you manage, looking at their KPIs, looking at your own KPIs. And if you lead a business unit, looking at what it is, what's counting as success, what are your metrics, and how are we even measuring the financial performance of our organizations. I think it's interesting to think about how reimagining and perhaps resetting some of the standards around performance and measurement right now might be required in order to move through this tumultuous time. And I think we're seeing indicators of that within the markets. Large companies are delaying changing the direction and the guidance that they put out to analysts. We're seeing the delaying of individual performance reviews until a next quarter, because obviously people aren't performing the way they might when they're at home trying to manage kids, et cetera, homeschooling. So I do think that something that you can really practically do is think about, if you're a manager or a leader, how might we reimagine performance metrics right now to enable some of the change in fluidity and agility and pivots that need to happen.
Angèle, I'm going to give you the last word, but you in a minute or less.
Okay. Well, I'll say two quick things, really to build upon Azadeh's and Emma's points. Is give yourself permission to actually think differently, and give your team permission to do so. And then to kind of dovetail onto that, ask more questions. So if you actually feel you have all the answers, ask more questions about why you believe you have those questions, and ask, what don't you know? And so I'd say even those small practices of you come in and you may have a statement, be more curious, really start asking more questions about what you don't know, and engage in that learning process. Learn new online tools, learn how people are behaving, and embed those in terms of your everyday or your workplace tasks.
Great advice. Emma, Azadeh, Angèle, I want to thank you tremendously for what's been a great discussion. You've given us lots of practical advice that we're going to need to get through this. I'm going to close off by answering another question we're getting from many people. A number of people have asked, how do we learn more about this? My theory is never miss a marketing opportunity. Fortunately, at Rotman, we have a solution for you. In fact, Angèle is offering a course which is going to be delivered virtually called Innovation Readiness for a New Normal, a real-time virtual experience. And if you go to rotmanexecutive.com, you can get the information. If that doesn't work, just call us. We'd love to get you signed up. Next week's Managing Uncertainty webinar is going to focus on something on all our minds, navigating personal finance during COVID-19, what you need to know to take control. Azadeh, Emma, Angèle, thank you again. It's been a wonderful conversation. I hope everybody has a good week, and I hope I see as many of you as possible next week.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, thanks for having us.
Pleasure.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye till next week.